Welcome back to Be You and Be Real. I am excited that you're here for chapter 2. In chapter 2, I'm actually going to dive into my story a little bit. I'm your host, Nathan Daniel, and let's get ready. I'm going to cue up the music and let's dive into this chapter. Welcome to the Be You and Be Real podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Daniel, and I'm excited that you're here because I want to help people tell their story. Because if you don't tell your story, no one else will. So we're going to jump in and have real conversation with extraordinary people. Let's open the next chapter of the Be You and Be Real podcast. All right. So in this chapter, I want to dive in and go back to episode 1, where I was actually talking to a gentleman by the name of Mike. So Mike, I had met in an airport. I was actually sitting at Midway Airport in Chicago, and I was scheduled to be on stage the next day, speaking at an event. And I was going to be telling my story of kind of my journey and how I'd come to be where I was at that moment in time. And as I was sitting down and having this conversation with Mike, he kind of had a breakdown moment where he was like, exactly where you're at today, or a year ago is where I'm at today. And so I want to take you back. I want to take you back to that moment in time where I had an awakening. I had allowed myself to become a zombie, if you will, and I allowed myself to start living on somebody else's path other than my own. And it wasn't by their fault. I will say this up front. It was not by their fault by any means. It was something I allowed myself to do. And what happens all along the way is sometimes our reality shifts. So it started back. I was in a leadership position in an organization, and I absolutely loved it. I loved the people I was working with. I loved the environment I was working with, and just all along the way, I learned so many lessons. Right, whether it was business, and also personal lessons that I learned all along the way. But after doing it for a long period of time, there was a lot of pressure in this role. And along the way, I kind of started feeling myself getting lost. And if you've ever felt that way, where you walk in and you're just kind of in zombie mode and you're showing up, but you're not really present, that's where I was at. And all of a sudden, I was in this course, and this course promoted actually writing a letter to yourself a year out. And I'd forgotten that I was in that course because I'd taken that multiple times. But all of a sudden, in my mailbox, I get this letter. And I knew what was in the letter. You see, what they had you do is they had you write to your future self what you hope to accomplish, and the dreams that you hope to accomplish, the goals financially, and what that would mean for yourself and your family and your business. And I knew when I got that letter that I didn't want to open it. And it was the first time that I'd gotten a letter that I was nervous about opening it. And so it sat on my counter for about a week. And my wife finally said, all right, it's time. Open this letter up and let's look at it. And when I did, I kind of broke down. I had a moment where I realized for the first time that I'd gotten this letter, and I'd received like 7 other letters before that. I hadn't accomplished a single thing in that letter. And what it did is it kind of triggered me. It triggered me to a moment of, okay, what am I doing? And why am I doing this? And it awakened me from a state of being an extreme burnout and just, like I said before, a walking zombie, that I finally had this moment of, am I happy doing what I'm doing? And so I called one of my coaches, love her to death. Her name is Denise Ackerman, and I'm sure I'll have her on the show in the future, and she'll talk about this. But she started taking me through an exercise, and what got me the most was when we got on our first call. And it was Zoom, and she looked at me, and she coached me when I was a young real estate agent, and she knew how on fire I was to change the world and do all these big things, and just a big visionary. Well, she ended up looking at me straight through Zoom, and she said, Nathan, where's the kid I knew? You're dead inside. There's no fire. I see no spark in you right now. And so from that moment, we started a journey together, and she took me through this exercise where I had to do a lot of internal reflecting and everything. But what I realized is I wasn't happy anymore in that specific role. And again, I want to say this, I'm not talking negative on that role, because again, I learned so much, and I'm so appreciative of that opportunity that I earned there. And it made me a part of who I am today, because that's all about our story, right? we have these life experiences all along the way that craft us as who we are. And we have to tell this. And that's why I'm telling this story right now is I had that awakening moment, and it took a couple months. It took a couple months for me to have that moment and realization and that hard fact, because I'd accomplished a lot of things. My wife and I had been trying for several years, another chapter, but we tried for several years to have our son. And finally he was with us. And he was about to be 2 years old at the time. And, one of my goals since I was 14 years old was to be able to allow her the opportunity to be a stay-at-home mom if she chose to do that. And we were in this world, and all of a sudden I thought I was in a role where I was going to be there for 15, 20 years. And next thing I know, terror and fear started kicking in because I wasn't happy. And I didn't, see myself living that world for much longer. And so I had to explore what was next. And as I took this journey and found my passion and found what I loved and explored what if it were possible and what if I could do it, alongside of Denise and the lessons that she taught me, it opened my eyes that I lost my authentic self along the way. And I allowed myself to start living on somebody else's journey and somebody else's path, which there's nothing wrong with, but it wasn't my path to live anymore. And so at a moment in a fork in the road, I had to make a decision to continue on that path or step away. And so I decided to step away. And it was a hard moment. There was a hard, extreme moment because I had no idea what I was going to do. But I knew I had to step out in faith. And that moment came at church. And whether you go to church or whatever spiritual, hey, I go to church, so I'm going to talk about it. But at the end of this, at this church service that we walked into one Sunday, we were late. Again, I was a zombie. I was in zombie mode at the time. So we were late. We sat in the back of the room. We dropped Callan off at Sunday school. And all of a sudden, we're just packed. Like, church is packed. And there's somebody new up leading worship for that Sunday. And apparently she was really good, like written songs for some amazing bands and productions and all sorts of stuff, has her own band. And they were bringing it. I mean, people were like in the moment of worship, and I wasn't. I just felt nothing inside. I felt empty. And at that same moment, everybody sat down, and it was in the middle of March. I remember very vividly this experience when our pastor was doing a series called The Assist. And, following March Madness basketball, that's what it was all about. So he did an assist, and he looked down, he said, hey, I'm going to do an assist today. I'm actually bringing up a very good friend of mine, and brought him up on stage. And he started sharing the lesson, right? There was a lesson that was planned around the assist and everything else. And it was very crafted very well. But about 5 minutes into his message, he stopped. The pastor stopped and looked over at our pastor and said, hey, I have to deviate from our lesson. If I get back to it, I will. But he started talking about some of the fruits of the Spirit and other things that he preached on. And he talks about why he focused primarily on youth, and why he focuses on large conferences and speaking at large conferences, because he has the ability to speak to crowds. And along the way, he just felt something moving in him to share his what he was being told at that moment. And so he did. So he asked all of us to stand up. He asked us to get in a mode of prayer, a mode of worship. And so I stood up. I stood up with everybody else, bowed my head. Again, not really feeling anything at this moment. And in that moment, he starts talking and praying. And he says, there's some people in this room dealing with fertility issues. And don't worry, God's got you. Have faith in him. And he's good. And no joke, like, this is what I heard. All of a sudden he speaks and he says, you, sir, in the back of the room are going to start a business this year, and you're going to impact the lives of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And you don't have to know the how or the why. You just have to have faith. So of course, what happens? I am grown man, ugly cry in the middle of this service. And in that moment, there was instant peace that I knew if I stepped out in faith, that I would be taken care of, and the message and what I needed to deliver to the world, it was going to be okay. And actually, in that moment is where this idea of Be You and Be Real came from. It was finding your authentic voice and being okay sharing that with the world and not letting others judge you based upon that, right? Sharing your authentic story and living on your path, right? Again, I've said this a second ago, but we live in a world of circumstances and situations that create who we are today. The lessons that we learn along the way are how we're crafted. And so through all of that experience, I was sharing this with the gentleman, Mike, and it allowed him in that moment to take some time and reflect on his own world and where he lived at. And again, I wish I would have written his name down, his full name down, but all I know is his name was Mike. He went on his plane. I went on my plane after we got cleared to take off. And all I know is that if I hadn't have shared my story at that moment, I'm not sure Mike would have heard that. And he probably would have gone on with his life as normal. But maybe, just maybe, that message resonated with him. And he took back and created something in his world and maybe changed his life, maybe changed something in his world for the better. Who knows? But that's why we have to tell our stories, right? We've got to tell our story in an extremely purposeful way that could have impacts and ripples throughout history. So that's a little bit of my story. That's a portion, a chapter of my life. And I hope that it meant something to you. And that's what I hope to get out of this show, is to share moments like this and chapters of people's lives that there are lessons to be learned along the way. Like, be you and be real, live your authentic life. And sometimes the struggles are what lead us to our biggest breakthroughs. So thank you for joining me on this chapter where I shared a portion of my life. And I look forward to seeing you on the next chapter of Be You and Be Real. Well, thank you for tuning in to this chapter of the Be You and Be Real podcast. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. If you or someone you know is looking to share your story, go to beyouandbereal.com to inquire how to become a guest on the show. Until next time, live your life on purpose. Be you and be real. We'll see you in the next chapter.